August 7, 1944. Near Avranches, Normandy, French cut up by thousands of vehicles funneling through a narrow gap torn open in the German line. For 6 weeks after D-Day, the Allied invasion of France had been trapped in the hedgerows, bleeding men and momentum for every field gained. Now that stalemate has finally cracked. Operation Cobra has shattered the German front, and the U.S. Third Army, newly activated and unleashed, is pouring through the breach with a speed no one in Allied headquarters had dared to plan for on paper. At the center of that surge is Lieutenant General George S. Patton. To the public, he is the loud, profane cavalryman reincarnated in steel. To the Germans, he is something more dangerous, a commander who does not pause once momentum is achieved. Patton understands that the German army in France is not yet destroyed, it is merely disoriented. If given time, it will recover, consolidate, and counterattack with the same skill it has demonstrated since 1939. The window to turn a breakout into a collapse is narrow, measured in days, not weeks. German commanders understand this as well. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, is facing a catastrophe. His units have been mauled by Allied air power, his reserves are exhausted, and his orders from Hitler are contradictory to the point of paralysis. Hold ground at all costs, but also counterattack. Do not retreat, but restore the front. The German High Command still believes that a decisive armored blow can stop Patton before he reaches open country. To that end, Germany commits one of its last remaining symbols of battlefield dominance, the Tiger tank. By the summer of 1944, the Panzerkampfwagen WWII Tiger I has acquired an almost mythic reputation. With its 88mm gun and thick frontal armor, it can destroy any Allied tank at ranges where return fire is ineffective. American tank crews know the statistics. British intelligence reports confirm them. A frontal engagement with a Tiger is something to be avoided whenever possible. Doctrine says flank it, bypass it, or destroy it with artillery or air power. But doctrine assumes time, preparation, and clear intelligence. What Patton is about to encounter allows for none of those. As Third Army races south and west, German intelligence identifies a critical choke point where Patton's advance must pass. Roads converge, fuel depots lie exposed, and the terrain briefly favors defense. To blunt the American spearhead, the Germans assemble a powerful armored force, approximately 72 Tiger tanks, drawn from heavy panzer battalions rushed in from reserve. Their mission is simple in concept and desperate in execution. Stop Patton's advance long enough for the German front to stabilize. The German plan reflects both experience and desperation. The Tigers are not to fight a maneuver battle. They are to dig in, cover likely approach routes, and destroy American armor at long range. If Patton is forced to deploy, slow down, and concentrate forces, the window of chaos will close. Even a delay of 48 hours could change the entire campaign. What the Germans do not fully grasp is that Patton has no intention of giving them that kind of battle. By mid-August, Third Army's forward elements begin encountering reports of heavy armor ahead. Reconnaissance units spot telltale signs, widened tracks, crushed hedgerows, and burned-out villages where German engineers have prepared firing positions. Tankers talk quietly about Tigers. The word moves faster than any official briefing, carrying with it both fear and anticipation. Tigers are killers, but they are also slow, fuel-hungry, and rare. Patton's headquarters receives confirmation that a significant concentration of heavy tanks lies astride the advance. The expected response from a conventional commander would be to halt, bring up tank destroyer battalions, mass artillery, and plan a deliberate attack. Maps would be studied, fire plans drawn, timetables issued. Patton does none of that. Instead, he asks a different question: where are the Tigers not? Patton understands something fundamental about German heavy armor doctrine. Tigers are powerful, but they are inflexible. They require maintenance, fuel, and secure flanks. They cannot be everywhere at once. If the Germans have massed 72 Tigers in one sector, they have weakened others. More importantly, those tigers represent a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Their presence is meant to force the Americans to stop. Patton refuses to stop. Orders go out for continued advance on multiple axes. Infantry divisions are instructed to push through secondary roads. Armored units are told to probe aggressively, not to seek tank battles but to keep moving. Artillery is prepositioned not to destroy tigers head-on, but to isolate them, cutting roads, smashing supply columns, and collapsing command posts. Pressure becomes the weapon. German Tiger crews wait in ambush positions, engines idling, guns trained on open fields and road approaches. Hours pass. No massed American tank columns appear. Instead, small units slip through gaps. Infantry bypass strongpoints under cover of smoke and artillery. Fighter bombers roam overhead, attacking anything that moves during daylight. By the time the Tigers finally engage in force, the situation around them has already begun to unravel. American units avoid frontal clashes wherever possible. When contact is unavoidable, Sherman tanks do not charge. They withdraw, marking positions for artillery and airstrikes. Tank destroyers maneuver for side shots. Infantry infiltrates through villages and woods, calling in fire on German observation posts. Every Tiger that fires reveals its position, and every position becomes a target. The Tigers begin to kill, but not fast enough. Fuel shortages worsen. Ammunition runs low. Recovery vehicles cannot reach damaged tanks under constant air attack. Some Tigers are abandoned intact after mechanical failures, their crews blowing charges and retreating on foot. Others are knocked out not by tanks at all, but by artillery shells collapsing tracks or jamming turrets. Meanwhile, Patton's columns continue to flow around the engagement area, exploiting open roads the Tigers were never positioned to cover. German commanders request permission to redeploy, to pull back and form a new line. Orders from higher headquarters are delayed or denied. Hitler demands they hold. The result is not a climactic tank battle, but a slow strangulation. Within days, the German heavy tank force ceases to function as a coherent unit. Some Tigers are destroyed in combat. Others are immobilized and abandoned. Crews surrender after being cut off without fuel or food. The feared counterstroke dissolves into isolated actions with no strategic effect. Patton never personally witnesses most of these engagements. He does not need to. What matters to him is that the advance never pauses. Maps at 3rd Army headquarters show arrows stretching farther each day, bending and multiplying as resistance collapses unevenly across the front. For American soldiers on the ground, the lesson is unmistakable. The Tiger tank is terrifying, but it is not decisive when confronted by speed, coordination, and relentless pressure. The myth breaks not in a single dramatic battle, but through a series of small, exhausting defeats that deny the Germans the kind of fight they are built to win. By late August 1944, the road to the Seine lies open. German forces are retreating in disorder. The opportunity to stop Patton with heavy armor has passed, burned away by indecision, logistical collapse, and an enemy who refused to fight on expected terms. The 72 Tigers had been meant to halt an army. Instead, they became another obstacle that Patton simply flowed around, leaving behind wreckage, prisoners, and unanswered questions inside the German high command about how a weapon so feared could fail so completely under the pressure of modern, mobile warfare. As 3rd Army surged eastward, the consequences of that failed German stand became visible almost immediately. Roads once expected to be sealed by heavy armor were instead littered with abandoned equipment, half-tracked vehicles out of fuel, artillery pieces spiked by their crews, and Tiger tanks sitting silent in ditches, their massive weight having broken bridges or collapsed soft ground during hurried redeployments. American engineers marked routes around them, sometimes pausing only long enough to scrawl chalk notes, identifying a knocked-out Tiger before traffic flowed past again. The battlefield told a story not of tactical defeat alone, but of a system unraveling under pressure it could no longer absorb. German command staffs tried to reconstruct what had gone wrong. Reports filtered upward describing enemy units that never paused to consolidate, never assembled into predictable formations, and never offered the decisive armored clash German doctrine was designed to fight. Instead of a hammer blow, Patton had applied constant friction, forcing German units to respond to multiple threats simultaneously, exhausting their ability to concentrate combat power. The Tigers, optimized for deliberate engagements, had been committed into a fight that denied them the conditions they required to dominate. This realization came too late to alter events on the ground. As Patton's columns crossed rivers and bypassed fortified towns, German rear area commands found themselves abruptly on the front line. Signals units, supply depots, and headquarters staffs were overrun or captured before evacuation orders could be issued. Prisoners later described the shock of seeing American armor appear where no enemy was expected, sometimes emerging from wooded trails or minor farm roads, assumed to be impassable to large formations. The sense of control that German commanders relied upon simply vanished. For the American soldiers advancing behind the spearhead, the tempo created its own strain. Crews slept in shifts, ate when they could, and learned to perform maintenance under blackout conditions. Shermans wore out tracks and engines at an alarming rate, yet the flow never stopped for long. Patton's standing order, to fix vehicles forward whenever possible and abandon only when absolutely necessary, kept combat power moving even as logistical chains stretched thin. Risk was accepted knowingly, with the understanding that momentum itself reduced danger by keeping the enemy perpetually off balance. German attempts to re-establish armored blocking positions grew increasingly desperate. Without sufficient fuel or air cover, even surviving Tigers became liabilities. Moving them by day invited immediate attack from Allied fighter bombers. Moving them by night increased breakdowns and disorientation. Crews reported navigating by memory alone, maps rendered useless by the speed of the American advance. Each kilometer traveled forward reduced the chance of escape. Inside Third Army headquarters, the tone remained relentlessly forward-focused. Patton pressed subordinate commanders for distance covered, bridges seized, and crossings forced, not for enemy tanks destroyed. Kill counts mattered less than ground gained. The failure of the German Tiger concentration reinforced his belief that destruction of enemy forces was a byproduct of maneuver, not its primary goal. Encirclement, isolation, and collapse achieved results that direct confrontation could not. By the time German High Command issued new directives calling for withdrawal and reorganization, the battlefield had already moved on. Orders arrived at units that no longer existed as cohesive formations. The Tigers that had been intended to anchor a defensive line became static monuments to a vanished plan, photographed by intelligence teams and studied not as threats, but as evidence of a turning point in the war's character. For Allied planners observing the campaign, the implications were profound. The encounter demonstrated that even the most formidable weapon system could be neutralized if employed without flexibility against an opponent who refused predictability. It was not that the Tiger had suddenly become obsolete. It was that the conditions required for its success were increasingly rare in a battlefield dominated by air power, logistics pressure, and commanders willing to trade certainty for speed. As summer gave way to early autumn, Patton's army pushed deeper into France, carrying with it the lessons of that encounter. German forces would attempt again and again to check the advance with concentrated armor, and each time the same dynamic would reassert itself. The war in the West was no longer about whose tank was stronger on paper, but about who could impose their will faster than the enemy could react, repair, or recover. As the operational map at Third Army headquarters filled with new markers, the implications of that momentum became impossible to ignore. Entire German sectors that had been expected to hold for weeks were erased in days. Front lines lost their meaning as American units appeared deep in the rear, severing rail lines and capturing crossings that German planners had counted on for orderly withdrawals. The collapse was not uniform or dramatic in the way earlier defeats had been, but it was relentless, a steady erosion of coherence that no amount of individual bravery could reverse. German officers later described the psychological toll of fighting an enemy who never seemed to pause. Orders issued at dawn were obsolete by noon. Reconnaissance reports arrived describing American columns already beyond positions that were supposed to block them. Attempts to establish new defensive belts were undone before artillery could be emplaced or infantry properly dug in. The battlefield had become fluid to a degree that traditional command structures could not manage, especially for an army already strained by years of attrition on multiple fronts. For Patton, this chaos was not incidental but intentional. He understood that speed created confusion, and confusion magnified every weakness the enemy possessed. By forcing German commanders to react instead of plan, he deprived them of the one advantage they still retained: experience. Veterans of Poland, France, and the early campaigns against the Soviet Union found themselves unable to apply the lessons of those victories to a situation where the enemy refused to fight on expected terms. The American advance also exposed the limits of German logistics with brutal clarity. Fuel shortages, already severe, became catastrophic once supply depots fell into Allied hands or were rendered unusable by rapid overruns. Even units that escaped encirclement often did so without their heavy equipment, abandoning tanks and guns simply to keep moving. The Tiger, designed to dominate the battlefield through firepower and armor, was particularly vulnerable in this environment. Its immense fuel consumption and maintenance demands turned it from an asset into a liability when retreat replaced deliberate defense. Allied air superiority compounded these problems. As skies cleared, fighter bombers roamed freely over roads and railways, attacking anything that moved. German commanders learned to disperse their columns and travel by night, but this only slowed movement further and increased the risk of mechanical failure. The very measures taken to survive made coordinated action increasingly impossible. Among American troops, the reputation of the Tiger began to change. Crews still respected its firepower and armor, but fear gave way to more pragmatic understanding. The tank was dangerous when encountered head-on under controlled conditions, yet those conditions were becoming rare. More often, Tigers were found immobilized, abandoned, or destroyed by artillery and air attack rather than tank-on-tank combat. The myth of invincibility eroded not through a single dramatic battle, but through repeated demonstrations of vulnerability. At higher levels of Allied command, Patton's methods continued to provoke debate. Critics argued that his pace risked overextension, that a single successful German counterstroke could sever supply lines and isolate forward units. Supporters countered that the enemy no longer possessed the strength or coordination to mount such an effort. Each day that passed without a decisive German response strengthened the case that relentless pressure was not recklessness, but a calculated exploitation of enemy weakness. German attempts to regain the initiative grew increasingly symbolic. Local counterattacks achieved temporary success, only to be bypassed and rendered irrelevant within hours. Units ordered to hold at all costs discovered that costs could no longer be calculated in meaningful terms. Holding ground without mobility or supply meant annihilation or capture, and more German commanders began to choose surrender over futile resistance. As the campaign unfolded, the failure of the Tiger concentration against Patton's advance came to be seen not as an isolated misjudgment, but as a reflection of a broader strategic collapse. The German army, once renowned for its operational flexibility, found itself trapped by doctrines and weapons optimized for a type of war that no longer existed. In contrast, the American approach, still evolving and imperfect, proved adaptable enough to exploit changing conditions faster than the enemy could respond. The road eastward remained contested, and the fighting ahead would bring new challenges and reversals. But the lesson had been written clearly across the landscape. In a war defined by movement and pressure, even the most powerful tools could fail if they were deployed too slowly, too cautiously, or in service of plans that assumed a stable front. Beyond the immediate tactical outcomes, the consequences of that failure rippled upward through the German command system. Reports reaching Army Group headquarters became increasingly contradictory, not because officers were careless, but because reality on the ground shifted faster than the reporting cycle could handle. A Tiger battalion listed as engaged in the morning might be partially destroyed, scattered, or out of fuel by afternoon, yet still appear on situation maps as a coherent blocking force. Decisions made on that outdated information only deepened the crisis. Patton's staff understood this lag and exploited it deliberately. Reconnaissance units were pushed far ahead of the main body, not to fight decisive engagements, but to sow uncertainty. A single armored column appearing unexpectedly near a crossroads could trigger German orders to redeploy forces miles away, weakening sectors that were already fragile. In this environment, the presence of Tigers did not stabilize the front. It distorted German perceptions of where the front even was. German tank commanders faced impossible choices. Holding position risked encirclement and destruction by artillery or air attack. Withdrawing invited accusations of defeatism and disobedience, especially understanding orders that forbade retreat without explicit permission. The very weight of the Tiger, both literal and symbolic, trapped its crews. A vehicle built to dominate static engagements became a liability in a campaign where static positions ceased to exist. American combined arms doctrine showed its value repeatedly. When Tigers were encountered in strength, Patton's units rarely sought frontal duels. Artillery was called in with speed and accuracy that astonished German observers, forcing heavy tanks to button up or withdraw. Infantry maneuvered to threaten flanks and rear areas, cutting off resupply and observation. Tank destroyers and Shermans were used flexibly, not as lone hunters, but as part of a system designed to overwhelm through coordination rather than raw power. This approach reflected years of hard lessons learned since North Africa. Early encounters with German armor had exposed weaknesses in American equipment and training, but they had also driven rapid adaptation. By the time of Patton's advance, American forces were no longer fighting the war they had planned in 1941. They were fighting the war that existed in 1944 and 1945, one dominated by mobility, communications, and the integration of firepower across domains. German veterans later noted that the most unsettling aspect of Patton's operations was not any single battle, but the absence of pauses. There was no clear moment to regroup, no lull during which shattered units could be reconstituted. Even at night, the sound of engines and distant artillery suggested that the advance never truly stopped. This constant pressure eroded morale as effectively as physical losses. At the same time, Patton's momentum imposed its own strains. Supply columns stretched thin, and fuel shortages occasionally threatened to halt the very movement that defined his success. Yet these moments rarely lasted. Risks were accepted consciously, calculated against the assessment that the enemy was even more fragile. Patton's gamble rested on the belief that hesitation would be more dangerous than audacity. Within Allied headquarters, the contrast between expectation and reality became stark. Pre-war studies had emphasized the danger posed by heavy German tanks, projecting grim scenarios of attritional battles dominated by superior armor. The campaign unfolding on the map told a different story. Heavy tanks could still inflict losses, but they could not restore operational coherence once it was lost. Speed, coordination, and pressure had proven decisive. The attempted stand by concentrated Tiger forces thus entered the record not as a climactic showdown, but as evidence of a deeper truth about the war's final phase. Germany's remaining strength lay in isolated pockets of excellence, skilled crews, formidable machines, local successes, while the Allies wielded an increasingly effective system that transformed local victories into irreversible momentum. As Patton's forces pushed onward, the landscape bore silent witness to that imbalance. Burned-out hulks along roadsides, abandoned repair depots, and columns of prisoners moving westward under guard. Each was a fragment of a larger collapse, one accelerated by the failure of even the most feared weapons to impose order on a battlefield defined by speed and relentless advance.